Hey, good morning, everyone. Really nice to see all the different people who are joining this morning. I know from several different countries, different parts of the U.S. Really nice. So I think I'll get started to introduce the seminar and the speakers and that speaker, but a few more people will continue to join while I do. So first, I want to say it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this. It's a new and special AmeriFlux series, and in a nod to the confluence of different streams of thought coming together, this webinar is called the ConFlux. It's Flux and environmental research in conversation with Indigenous partners. I'm Margaret Torn of the AmeriFlux Management Project, or AMP, and on behalf of AMP and the organizing committee for this series, which I want to thank especially Jeremy Forsyth, Alex Wallach, Avni Malhotra, and Christine Buchner, among others. I want to welcome you, and we're really delighted to be here. And I know we're all listening from different places. I'm speaking to you in the ancestral and current home of the Ohlone people here in Berkeley, California. And we're honored and delighted to have Ryan Emanuel as our leadoff speaker. So I'd like to just introduce him briefly. Ryan Emanuel is an associate professor of hydrology at Duke University and an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. He's an ecohydrologist, but he also studies historical and cultural aspects of water, including Indigenous peoples' relationships with rivers, wetlands, and other waterscapes. And he has a small background in biometeorology, but that won't be the focus today. And his research group partners with Indigenous communities to identify and address threats to culturally important waters. And those threats could be from pollution, climate change, and also the unsustainable development around us. His most recent book is On the Swamp, Fighting for Indigenous Environmental Justice. And we're really excited to hear more from him as he's informing environmental science through the environmental justice lens. I want to say before we get started that we're in the process, this is a series, let me say that. It's a webinar series, so we have more webinars coming up. So please keep checking on our mailing list or Twitter account or our website. But already you can register for the next webinar on August 19, and that's in which Angela Walkichik at the University of Wisconsin is going to speak on considerations for tribal engagement. So thank you for letting me introduce you, Ryan, and let's get to Ryan's talk. After Ryan speaks, there'll be a Q&A and discussion, and Christine and I will help moderate that. But at that time, feel free to use the chat or raise your hand on Zoom to join the Q&A at the end. All right. So thank you, Ryan. Please take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much for the great introduction and for giving me the honor of being your kickoff speaker for this series. Can everybody see my shared screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. I think it's critically important for those of us who are trained in Western academic institutions to broaden our perspectives on the environmental sciences through conversations like this one and the broader conversation that this series is meant to foster. So my hope is that you come away from today's conversation with ideas and questions that you can apply in your own work, whatever that happens to be. In particular today, I want to discuss some ideas around environmental justice and engagement with Indigenous peoples or other marginalized groups in the U.S. So I'll start by venturing to guess that many of you here today come from a similar academic background as me. I was trained as an interdisciplinary environmental scientist in programs that emphasized experimentation, modeling, and hypothesis testing. Academic traditions such as geoscience or ecology. I actually started my career in the 1990s studying hydrology as an undergraduate geology student, while simultaneously working for the U.S. Geological Survey to help maintain a network of stream flow and rainfall monitoring stations around the Charlotte metropolitan area in North Carolina. Then as a grad student in the early 2000s, those technical skills allowed me to pivot into eddy covariance field studies just as the AmeriFlux program was expanding and introducing micrometeorological flux methods to a much broader audience of researchers. And I became one of those researchers, spending about a decade using a combination of flux towers, ground-based measurements, and remote sensing to study patterns and processes in spatially heterogeneous water and carbon fluxes. I really enjoyed that work, but at the same time, I didn't feel a strong connection between my research and the community that I was accountable to. Let me clarify what I mean here. As a Lumbee person, I belong to a community that expects young people to pursue as much education as possible and then use that education to uplift the larger community in some fashion. Lumbee people have a long history of investing in education for ourselves. In the 1880s, we founded a training institute for teaching Native American teachers so that our children and children from neighboring tribes could attend schools during the many decades of legalized racial segregation in the American South. That institute eventually became the first public four-year college for Native Americans in the United States. It was also one of the first racially integrated colleges in the South, and it still operates today as one of the 17 campuses of the University of North Carolina system. So all of this is to say that Lumbee people value education, but they also expect education to be put to use in ways that serve the community. For the first 8 or 10 years of my faculty career, I really wasn't sure how to apply my knowledge of evapotranspiration, CO2 fluxes, and ecohydrological modeling to the pressing questions in our community. And so I put my expertise to work in other ways as an ambassador for science education, for example. I led environmental science field days for students in the Lumbee community and in neighboring tribal communities. I attended college fairs and I mentored young people from our communities who came to my university and needed support from someone who shared their cultural values and life experiences. As I pursued this service work in tandem with my research, I began to build strong relationships with individuals and institutions throughout the Lumbee community, among our neighboring tribal communities in North Carolina, and with Indigenous-led organizations, including the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs, which is an intertribal body that advises our state government on all matters related to Indigenous peoples in the state. Eventually, that led to a bifurcation in my research. My ecohydrology work continued, but at the same time, I became very interested in questions related to environmental justice, which is what I want to focus on today. The US EPA, for those of you who don't know, defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people in decision-making about the environment. Environmental justice arose as a social movement in the US during the 1980s as low wealth and racially marginalized communities organized to stop the long-standing practice of putting landfills, polluting industries, and hazardous infrastructure in places where they lived, worked, worshiped, and went to school. In the 1990s, a presidential executive order charged all federal agencies with identifying and addressing these kinds of disparities in federal actions, including actions regulated by the National Environmental Policy Act. In the decades since, environmental justice has come to mean not only that original social movement, but also a policy arena and an area of academic research that studies not only the inequitable distribution of environmental goods and bads, but also the root causes of those disparities. As environmental scientists or natural resource managers or other professionals working in environmental fields, many of us increasingly find that our work and possibly our whole selves are drawn into one or more of these spheres of environmental justice. And that's my motivation today, environmental justice for environmental science. Oftentimes, when scientists think about the relationship between our work and environmental justice, we conceptualize that relationship as unidirectional, which is to say that our research informs efforts to promote justice. Perhaps through environmental monitoring of air or water quality, modeling of pollution dispersion, or some kind of geospatial analysis. We're doing work that could improve lived experiences of people in their environments, or work that informs public policies that are intended to address these disparities, or builds capacity within communities to advance their own visions of healthy environments. We could even think about studies of carbon, water, and energy fluxes as fitting this model, perhaps indirectly, in so much as studies can help reduce uncertainty in carbon budgets that decision makers rely on to set greenhouse gas policies and address climate change. But to give you a more direct example of how research can inform efforts to promote justice in this unidirectional sense, I'll share an example from a project that I worked on several years ago. During the 2010s, the Waterkeeper Alliance conducted an inventory of concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, in North Carolina. They did this because public data from state regulators were difficult to come by, especially for poultry CAFOs, which don't fall under the purview of most environmental permits and have erupted across the state in the past decade. In my lifetime, CAFOs have become an enormous industry in North Carolina. Facilities in the state raise approximately 10 million hogs each year and nearly 1 billion chickens each year. So you can see on the left side of this slide a complex of swine CAFOs, including a battery of sheds and unlined cesspools that store waste from animals. That waste is held temporarily in these pools and then sprayed on nearby pastures and crop fields using irrigation equipment. Industrial livestock production's an issue of great societal interest for reasons that include everything from animal welfare to air and water pollution to labor issues and public nuisances. In North Carolina, these facilities are disproportionately located in African American, Native American, and Hispanic communities. But prior to the Waterkeeper inventory, we have little idea about the overall distribution of these types of facilities with respect to things like land cover or watershed. So with permission from Waterkeeper Alliance, we juxtapose their inventory with the National Land Cover data set and with watershed boundaries to better describe where CAFOs are located. And that analysis revealed some striking details. For example, it showed that two relatively small watersheds, which only drain 6% of the state, contain nearly half of the state's swine CAFOs. More interestingly, it showed that a substantial number of wetland pixels in the data set are occupied not by actual wetlands, but by industrial livestock facilities, which themselves can be larger than actual NLCD pixels. And while we know that wetlands can provide ecological benefits from filtering water, absorbing pollution, and sequestering carbon, we also know that CAFOs have the opposite function as sources of pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. So in essence, these ecological functions of these particular pixels are misrepresented in studies that rely on land cover to study topics such as pollution and climate change. So in the years since that publication, a number of community groups in the region have used this work to support their calls to regulate CAFOs more stringently and to check the uncontrolled growth of the poultry CAFOs throughout the state. These groups are especially concerned that poultry CAFOs will replicate the spatial patterns of swine CAFOs and will further entrench the disparities that are associated with these kinds of operations. So this study kept a spotlight on CAFOs as a social and an ecological issue of great concern. So to the extent that community groups use this work to amplify their calls for action by state regulators, one might consider this study to be an example of environmental science for environmental justice. And I'm sure you can think of many other examples, and some of you have been involved in this exact kind of research yourselves. And while this work is important and necessary, what I really want to do today is examine the flip side of this relationship. How can environmental justice improve environmental science? In other words, how can the principles of environmental justice improve the quality of our work? Or at a more fundamental level, how can it make us better scientists, managers, and professionals? I'm going to pause here for a moment to explain what I mean by the principles of environmental justice. In 1991, before the presidential executive order on environmental justice, leaders from marginalized communities of color throughout the United States gathered in Washington, D.C. to craft a formal declaration that outlines 17 core principles of environmental justice. I'm not going to list them all here, but instead I'll say that the principles embody values that include commitment to actions that eliminate and prevent disparities, deference to local and indigenous expertise, and prioritization of relationships, including relationships among different groups of people and relationships between humans and the non-human world. Within these 30-year-old plus principles, you can find rather progressive declarations on topics such as the rights of nature and the right to free, prior, and informed consent. So the question I really want to tackle is the following. How can environmental justice promote better environmental science? In my view, the answers to this question can help clarify what is not a one-way relationship between environmental justice and environmental science, or vice versa, but is actually a bidirectional relationship between the science that we do and the values that motivate our work as scientists. The simple framework shown here doesn't capture every situation, of course, and it may not even seem applicable to the work that some of us do, but I hope it serves to illustrate the potential for environmental justice and environmental science to exist in a beneficial and reinforcing cycle. So let's think about some of the ways that environmental justice can influence the work we do as environmental scientists. I want to start by highlighting some specific ideas about how this plays out. And then I'd like to share a detailed example that I think can illustrate these ideas in action. The first idea is that the values associated with environmental justice can influence the questions that we choose to ask or the hypotheses that we choose to test. The second idea is that environmental justice can affect the perspectives that we choose to foreground in our work. The third idea is that environmental justice also speaks to the responsibilities and accountabilities that we have as researchers. So the example that I want to offer is really a story about building professional relationships and building trust with communities during a period of natural gas infrastructure expansion in the southeastern US. An expansion that began about a decade ago and it continues to this day. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, energy companies in the Southeast were responsible for two massive coal ash spills, one in Tennessee and the other one along the North Carolina-Virginia border. Around the same time, a fracking boom in the shale basins of West Virginia brought a glut of natural gas to regional energy markets. Those two factors, the liability of waste from coal and the proximity of abundant shale gas, persuaded large energy corporations to propose a 1,000-kilometer transmission pipeline to supply brand new gas-fired power plants designed to replace coal in the region's energy mix. So the figure at right shows the route of that pipeline through West Virginia, Virginia, and North Carolina. And it also names some of the tribal nations in North Carolina whose territories would be crossed by the pipeline, which was initially proposed in 2014 and ultimately canceled in 2020. Note from the inset map that the pipeline's southern terminus would have been located in a historic Lumbee community called Prospect. This issue was personal to me, given that some 20,000 Lumbees, or about 1/3 of our total tribal enrollment, lived along the pipeline route and would be exposed to the possibility of declining property values, air pollution, and explosion risks. Overall, about 30,000 American Indians lived along the pipeline route, meaning that 1 in 4 indigenous peoples in North Carolina lived in this affected area. So in 2017, I started working closely on pipeline-related research and outreach with North Carolina's Commission of Indian Affairs. Our work started 2 years after the project was publicly announced because that was the first time that many tribal leaders in the state had ever heard of it. That year, federal regulators released a draft environmental impact statement declaring the project free of any environmental justice concerns. So, one major problem with that assertion was that the regulators relied on a demographic analysis that was fundamentally flawed. Another problem with the assertion was that no one bothered to gather input from any of the North Carolina tribes prior to researching and writing the environmental impact statement. As some of you who may know me might remember, I spent much of 2017 meeting with tribal leaders individually and in groups to walk through this flawed demographic analysis and to raise awareness about the need to provide input into the decision-making process for the pipeline. I helped tribal leaders in the state prepare comments to the federal government on the draft environmental impact statement, and I helped them come up with strategies for amplifying their own voices in the permitting process. I also submitted my own technical report to the regulatory agency, and soon afterwards, Science published a greatly abridged version as a commentary on the need to couple rigorous demographic analytics with meaningful tribal engagement in order to truly meet the goals of federal environmental justice policy. Unfortunately, regulators largely ignored all of these requests for corrective measures, and they moved forward with plans to approve that pipeline. But widespread public opposition, combined with a string of state and federal lawsuits, led to years of delays and billions of dollars in cost overruns, which ultimately forced energy companies to abandon the project. So at this point, those of you who are familiar with federal Indian policy may be puzzled as to why these tribes weren't consulted as required by both federal laws and executive orders. The reason is that tribes along the pipeline route were excluded from these protective measures because of their status as non-federally recognized tribes. So for all practical purposes, that also includes my tribe because our recognition status is still defined to this day by a 1956 federal law that identifies us as Indigenous peoples, but prohibits us from holding a formal relationship with the United States. So while I was working on this project alongside tribal leaders between 2017 and 2020, I had to do a tremendous amount of work to build the background knowledge and competence on environmental justice policies that I needed to carry this out in a responsible and systematic way. I mention this to emphasize that my lived experience as an Indigenous person didn't inherently confer expertise about all the relevant topics needed to conduct meaningful research here. I also relied heavily on collaborations that I built during this time, including one with political scientist David Wilkins. So in 2020, Wilkins and I published a critical analysis of barriers to tribal participation and pipeline permitting that focus on North Carolina. And as part of that work, we constructed the chronology shown here of key events in the life of this pipeline project, where colors represent different actors, federal, state, corporate, and tribal, in this life cycle of pipeline permitting. Of course, you can find a larger readable version in the online publication. But I show this to say one key takeaway is that there were very few efforts at tribal engagement made by any actors, state, federal, or corporate. And the efforts that did take place took place too late and on too short or compressed of a schedule to allow for any meaningful consideration of Indigenous peoples' priorities or values or their inherent visions of justice for their own communities. And then less than a month after this pipeline was canceled in 2020, and a few weeks after publishing this study, elected council members from my tribe received a request from one of the energy companies behind this pipeline to attend a meeting for a brand new project. It turns out that this company had purchased 600 acres of forest land in a different Lumbee community and they were planning to build a liquefied natural gas processing and storage facility on that property. When finished, it would store something like 1 billion cubic feet of gas. And it was designed to give the company a buffer against price spikes by allowing them to fill up the massive tank, which you can see below under construction during times of low prices, and then release that gas back into their own system when prices are high or when demand is exceptionally high. And because I had spent the past 3 years working closely with my tribal council on issues around the failed Atlantic Coast Pipeline, council members immediately reached out to ask if I would attend this meeting to hear what the company had to say. I was asked to simply listen and not respond or even speak at all during this meeting. The tribal council also asked me to attend a separate meeting and give them a briefing on what I had heard. And the map that you see here is one of the figures that I prepared for that meeting. It shows existing and proposed natural gas infrastructure embedded within these two Lumbee communities, Prospect and Wakulla. I wasn't exactly sure where all of this was headed, but I did the work anyway. I agreed to show up, and I came to that meeting. So this meeting with the energy company executives, which was held via Zoom during the COVID-19 pandemic, began with a statement by one of the vice presidents that went something like this. I want to clarify up front that our pipelines aren't disproportionately located in marginalized communities because our pipelines are located everywhere. Now, at this point, dear webinar attendee, you can probably envision the massive eye roll that came over my face in the Zoom window. But I followed the rules of the meeting and I did not interrupt. I didn't type anything in the chat window. I didn't do anything. I just sat and listened. But I did do one thing. I thought, that sounds like a testable hypothesis. So as soon as this meeting was over, I started looking for data sets that I could actually use to test the hypothesis that natural gas pipelines are evenly distributed with respect to metrics that might be associated with marginalization of communities. And it didn't take long to find some useful data sets that we could use in this type of study. It turns out that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention publishes a nationwide data set called the Social Vulnerability Index. Some of you may be familiar with this or have used it before. For those of you who are not familiar, social vulnerability is a holistic measure of a community's capacity to withstand or recover from adverse events. Now, these could include things like floods, epidemics, chemical spills, or a host of other stresses. This index is available for every US county, and it's updated every few years using census data and other relevant types of data sets. High values are considered vulnerable areas and vice versa. It is perhaps the closest thing we have in the US to an integrated measure of marginalization. There's also a nationwide data set on natural gas gathering and transmission pipelines, something like 300,000 kilometers of pipelines in total. This data set, which is published by the US Department of Transportation, is incomplete for various reasons, but it's the best publicly available geospatial product that we have. You can see both of those data sets juxtaposed on the map here. Note the social vulnerability is generally higher in the southern US than in the northern US. And pipeline networks predictably radiate out from gas producing areas like the Gulf of Mexico, Central Appalachia, and West Texas. Interestingly, one of the things that is missing from this pipeline data set is the majority of pipelines owned and operated by the energy company whose executive prompted me to collect these data in the first place. This is because DOT only shares geospatial data for interstate pipelines, those projects that cross state lines and are therefore regulated by the federal government. Data on pipeline networks wholly contained within states like North Carolina are not shared publicly. And so we didn't have any access to these. In order to test our specific hypothesis, our gas lines concentrated in areas of high social vulnerability, we had to transform the pipeline data to the same spatial scale as social vulnerability, the county scale. We did this by computing the length of pipeline per unit area of a county. We created a new variable called pipeline density, which is analogous to drainage density that might be used in hydrology or geomorphology. While I was conducting this geospatial analysis, I reached out to a team of social scientists, again, another collaboration. These folks study structural inequities related to environmental policy and management. This was important because this study needed to go beyond simply identifying a new kind of disparity. We already had decades of excellent research showing that these disparities exist in all kinds of settings. I wanted to be part of a group that could look deeper at things like how and why the disparities exist, and if possible, recommend ways to address them. That team included Martina Carretta, Louis Rivers, and Pavitra Vasudevan. So what did we find? Unsurprisingly, we found spatial correlations between pipeline density and social vulnerability for pipeline-containing counties across the United States. The effect was especially strong if we look at the extremes of pipeline density across bins of social vulnerability. In other words, people living in various tiers of social vulnerability experience different extremes of pipeline density. The scatter plot here shows the bin data, and you can see progressively stronger relationships as these values become more and more extreme. For example, people living in the top tiers of social vulnerability see maximum pipeline densities in the 50 to 60 kilometer per 100 square kilometer range, whereas people in the lowest tier of social vulnerability would see extremes that are roughly half that amount. And the table at the right shows our Pearson correlation coefficients for each set of data on the scatter plot. Another way to look at the data is using cumulative distribution functions. Here you can see CDFs of pipeline density for the top and bottom quartiles of social vulnerability. And unsurprisingly, the CDF for the most vulnerable quartile is shifted to the right, which is to say it shifted towards higher pipeline densities. And do note the logarithmic axes. This is just another way to show that the most vulnerable communities host higher densities of pipelines. And this figure shows that the difference persists across the entire distribution of pipeline densities. These are fancy ways of saying the same thing, that socially vulnerable communities shoulder a disproportionately large share of the burden from this type of fossil fuel infrastructure. From there, we thought about why this might be the case. In some parts of the US, the basic routes of pipeline networks were set decades ago before the civil rights era, when it was both legal and customary to put unwanted infrastructure in communities of color. New pipelines tend to follow old pipeline routes, meaning that the effects pile on through time. Not only that, but regulators have a long history of downplaying concerns about environmental justice when reviewing applications for pipeline permits. In particular, our group looked back over several years of environmental reviews led by the federal agency responsible for natural gas pipeline permitting, and we couldn't find a single instance in which the agency concluded that a pipeline would either create or exacerbate racial or socioeconomic disparities. So in the discussion of this paper, we offer one possible explanation, and that was that the historical legacy of pipeline placement combined with a regulatory environment that downplayed environmental justice and at the same time championed domestic energy security was a system that produced and maintained the disparity that we observed. Some of you may recognize this description as a hallmark of complexity, a system with emergent behavior that differs from the behavior of individual components. I think this framing is important because it shows how inequity can be created or sustained in a system, even if individual actors don't have discriminatory intentions. This was really helpful framing to share with tribal leaders and community members. We weren't out to demonize corporations or the people who work for them. We wanted to show how easily these disparities can be reproduced when individuals and institutions don't actively work to unmake them. This study had limitations, of course, but because the findings were straightforward and because the message was timely given policy discussions around energy security and climate change, it was really easy to communicate results back to the communities to which I was accountable. This study also received some media attention, including a feature in National Geographic that linked our study to observations in California, the Gulf Coast, and elsewhere. And so when people read these accounts and use this study to connect the dots, they're closer to seeing the type of emergent behavior, in this case, a structural inequity, that our team saw when we looked at the results. There were impacts beyond the media too. Soon after publication, DOT used our study to argue that updated safety rules for natural gas pipelines were essential for promoting environmental justice. In their view, this network is not going away anytime soon, and so improving safety will reduce the degree to which vulnerable communities are disproportionately exposed. So, a small victory, perhaps. Finally, the work fostered more nuanced discussions in the Lumbee tribal government and among other indigenous institutions in the region. And these were conversations about how to deal with ongoing issues of fossil fuel development within our state and within our tribal territories in particular. One outcome of those discussions was that the Lumbee Tribal Administration applied for and received a grant to create an advisory group of tribal members who have a basic understanding of environmental science and policy and who can advise tribal leaders on culturally appropriate steps to promoting justice within our own community. So I want to wrap up this example by returning to the ideas that we discussed earlier about how environmental justice principles can improve our work as scientists. Reviewing the simple cartoon conceptual diagram to remind us, I hope that the story I just told you illustrates how attentiveness to principles of environmental justice helped us to ask good questions, formulate good hypotheses, and so on. I hope this story also highlights the importance of showing up, even if you're not exactly sure what your role is or where the process is headed. I hope that you see how the principles of environmental justice call attention to the perspectives that we bring to our work, whether they are our own perspectives or those of the communities that we work with. The research that I share with you foregrounded perspectives from specific tribal nations who are very often overlooked in research and in public discourse on energy infrastructure and related issues. So if we truly value examining problems from all angles, then we need to pay attention to whose perspectives are missing from our deliberations. Then lastly, I hope that this story emphasizes the importance of thinking critically about the responsibilities and the accountabilities that we have as environmental scientists to particular people or communities or institutions. The principles of environmental justice call for reflection on those to whom we're accountable. Who are they specifically? And what exactly do our responsibilities entail? By paying attention to these ideas, we can improve on the work that we do as scientists. And these are just some of the ways that I see environmental justice feeding forward into environmental science in a virtuous cycle, such as the one shown in this cartoon here. I do want to pause here and say that in my case, my responsibility is extended beyond the scale of conventional research in our field. which typically involves getting grants, doing the work, writing the papers, and if we're lucky, a couple of interactions with the media. In my case, I felt compelled to paint a broader picture of the structures and the power dynamics that underpin and in some way unify many of the issues that I've worked on in recent years. I felt this way because I believe, and we have ample evidence to show, that remembering, recounting, and telling are crucial components of justice. And the best way I knew of to accomplish this goal was to write about it. And that's why I spent the past few years working on a book that attempts to organize issues such as wetland drainage and clear cutting, natural gas pipelines, industrial livestock production, and climate change into a unified, even if grim, portrait of the centuries-long legacy of colonialism in the place where I live, the place that we now call North Carolina. In order to do that, I had to pivot strongly and learn the tools and methods of other fields, especially history. And I had become a much more disciplined writer. I also had to figure out how to convey what is at times highly technical content for an audience that includes not only my colleagues, but also students from a wide range of disciplines. And most importantly, people from the communities to whom I'm accountable. So even though I'm Lumbee, the book also engages with our indigenous neighbors in Eastern North Carolina. I have professional and moral obligations to write in a way that is respectful, inclusive, and representative of the unique perspectives that each one of these communities brings to conversations about justice and human rights. And to be honest, my greatest fear and concern in writing this book was not getting those things right. But despite that fear, I think there is something in this book for anyone who wants to learn more about how Indigenous peoples in this part of the American South have adapted to centuries of radical environmental change while maintaining their collective cultures and identities. And not all of these transformations and adaptations have been traumatic. I include a hopeful story about the Coharie tribe, close neighbors and kin to Lumbee people, and their efforts to restore cultural connections to their namesake river. I also speculate on a future where Indigenous people participate meaningfully in decisions about their homelands for the benefit of everybody. The book follows my personal journey, but I think it holds lessons for any scientist who wants to apply the principles of environmental justice to their own work, particularly if that work engages Indigenous peoples in some way. In particular, it highlights the need for cultural competence to ensure that research efforts and other collaborations are meaningful and equitable. Marco Hatch and colleagues explain that this idea in a paper that was published last year in Ecology and Society on the role of boundary spanners in facilitating this kind of research. To learn more about cultural competency and why it matters, I would encourage you to see their excellent article. So in summary, I want to reiterate that environmental justice principles call on us as scientists and professionals to answer important questions about the work that we do. I really think this applies whether or not we consider ourselves to be community engaged scientists. For example, environmental justice calls on us to think about what motivates our research. Is it curiosity, lived experience, accountability to others, moral obligations? These are all great things. We're all motivated by something, but it's helpful to step back from our work from time to time and reflect on what those things are. Then think about the extent to which those motivations shape the way you make decisions about where you do research, how you do it, and with whom. Environmental justice also calls on us to ask what perspectives show up in this work, whose don't, and why is that the case? If we're interested in the behavior, status, or functions of the environment, we stand to lose important information if we ignore perspectives, particularly perspectives of people whose daily lives are impacted by the phenomena that we study in detail. Lastly, environmental justice calls on us to ask whether the work that we do dismantles the inequitable status quo, or whether our work possibly reinforces these inequitable systems. Even if your work is done in completely uninhabited areas, the open ocean or the South Pole, this applies to you. Consider the people that you teach or train or who work alongside you. What skills and expertise are they hoping to gain, and how do they plan to use it? Who are your trainees accountable to, and how can you equip them to fulfill their responsibilities? We can become better scientists by answering these kinds of questions about our work. I want to wrap up by sharing a quote that beautifully summarizes this notion of environmental justice for environmental science. A few months after the natural gas pipeline study was published, AGU's EOS featured it in a story about the importance of meaningful community relationship in environmental research. The story quoted a number of community engaged scholars, including Jacoby Wilson, who directs the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health at the University of Maryland. And Wilson says, when we're looking at various environmental phenomena, you want to engage those who are most impacted by the problem and those who experience it every day, because they're the contextual experts. When you engage communities, you get the best questions and the best data so you can get to the best solutions. And so, with that parting thought and those words by Wilson, I want to thank you all and hope that we have time for discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you. This little pause is just all of us reflecting and really appreciating your talk. It's
Yeah,
riveting.
absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. I guess if people might have questions, thoughts that they would like to share at this time. So if people could use Zoom to raise your hand or put a question in the chat. That would be a good way to do it, I think. Well, I guess if you want to turn on your video as well, that's great. So I guess people are putting questions in the chat. So why don't I read one
Sure.
for Kirsten Paff, who asked, do you have any suggestions on how to engage marginalized communities if one does not come from that community? And Kristen, if you wanted to add anything, please do.
Yeah, there's an active field of scholarship on community engagement and community engaged research, especially in the environmental sciences. A lot of that literature contains recommendations and promising practices about how to build relationship, which is really the core about meaningful engagement starts with meaningful relationship building, which means showing up and becoming part of that community to the extent that you're able, comfortable, and welcomed in. So many indigenous communities have events that are open to the public, celebrations such as powwows, right? And people are welcome to come out, experience and exchange culture during those events. And these are great places to begin meeting and building relationships with people, not with an underlying scientific agenda, but just to establish relationships, which are really the core of community engagement. There are more structured online tools to facilitate this type of matchmaking. One of the one of the leading ones is actually a part of AGU. It's the Thriving Earth Exchange. And so I would encourage you to look at this tool, which is basically something that matches up communities that have specific scientific needs with experts who are committed to ethical community engaged practices in order to collaborate and solve these questions of community importance.
Guess I'll just jump in. Have you worked with Thriving Earth Exchange? Any you've done?
Yeah, I work with folks who are part of Thriving Earth Exchange, but I have not been a collaborator on any of these projects to date. And part of it stems from my work focusing primarily on communities that I have established relationships already. And you will find in many cases, people who are embedded in communities tend to continue working in those same communities throughout their career. So tools like the Thriving Earth Exchange could be a way to initiate a relationship that could extend long beyond that initial question that prompted the Thriving Earth Exchange relationship. I will also put in a plug for anyone who plans to attend the AGU fall meeting in Washington, D.C. in December. We have a session each year called Indigenous Science to Action. It is a great place to hear from researchers who are working in collaboration with Indigenous communities to answer questions that are important to the communities that they're working with. It's an excellent place to network and to ask people about their specific circumstances, how they became involved with that community, et cetera. And so of course, we don't know the scheduling logistics yet, but sometime that week, we should have an Indigenous Science to Action session or sessions.
It's wonderful. And you also mentioned the AGU Science and Society section. This is a fairly new section and very active as well. And I hope people saw that there were journals, AGU journals like GeoHealth, that can be a good venue for work that maybe spans some boundaries.
Yes.
Leonie, do you want to ask your question or would you like me to read it?
Yeah, so good. Thank you. So besides questions and hypotheses, do you think you were able to include indigenous traditional knowledge in your sampling methods or in data analysis? I'm asking that because I work in the Amazon forest, so I interact with indigenous, and without them, I cannot do anything. So I really need their knowledge to do my sampling in the field. So I'm curious if you have anything to share in this sense too.
Yeah, and that is such an important topic. And it highlights not only the ability for indigenous knowledges to inform the kind of technology-driven science that we do, but also the ability for indigenous knowledge systems to underpin and even enable that science from the get-go. In our communities, it looks a little bit different. It has to do with knowledge about experiences living near natural gas pipelines and compressor stations and other infrastructure, right? We know that this infrastructure leaks from time to time, right? Because community members have reported that to us, even if the leaks don't rise to the level that they have to be reported to federal regulators, right? So we do have some idea of where and how often we have these incidents along pipelines, and you can't find those in the data, right? So that's one example of how indigenous knowledge systems informs the work that we do. It's very similar to local knowledge that you might have from any community who's an expert on their own, on their own environment.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah.
And I will add that we do have some follow-up field work that actually involves looking for fugitive methane emissions using the same field sampling techniques that you might use to study microbial soil processes. Methane fluxes, basically using soil chambers. And that work is so targeted that we have to rely on communities in order to know where to focus that work.
Thank you.
This is a good, I see this question in the chat about funding, particularly for early career scientists. It's tough, right? Because the major funding entities are just now, I'll be honest, they're just now coming around to the importance of community engaged work, and funding timelines and everything associated with the timing of grants is misaligned with the principle of building strong relationships with community, right? And so there are big challenges to overcome, especially for early career folks who are, and those who are reliant on competitive federal grants and things like this. I've been encouraged by things like NASA's call for research oriented towards environmental justice in the past couple of years. And, while the timeline issues still exist, there is growing acknowledgement from funding agencies that environmental justice is within the purview of environmental research more broadly. And we need to facilitate projects that advance our understanding of this important area of policy and social advocacy. So there are non-governmental organizations that have funded some of this work, including the Indian Collective. That's a group that is behind the land back hashtag. So if you're familiar with that on social media, you can search for that and find the Indian Collective. But a lot of this funding does exist outside of NSF, NASA, DOE, which means that there are much smaller pots of funding as well.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, there's a good question here about collaborating with Indigenous communities on tackling the risk of wildland fires. I know there's some great work happening on your side of the country with tribes in Northern California around bringing back good fire. And I think you all have there in your backyards, like some great examples of what those collaborations look like. I guess we're in a time of hubris now, right? After a century or two of fire suppression and not listening to Indigenous peoples on this topic. And there's some healing of relationships that has to happen, but there's already been good work overcoming that historical legacy and moving forward to bring back fire in a good way. I will say that in the Southeast, our landscapes were also managed extensively by fire prior to colonization. And, we've had fire suppression since approximately 1700 in our neck of the woods. And so we have a very long history to overcome. And Lumbee people just in the past year have started a cultural burn association, partnering with NGOs and state governments to figure out how we can be part of these efforts to restore fire-dependent ecosystems like the longleaf pine savanna, and to do it in a way that allows Lumbee people and other Indigenous people access to those places and to those tools so that we can we can relearn our ancestral practices, and we can access those managed landscapes that we're responsible for in the first place.
Good answer. Well, we're at the top of the hour, and want to take one more opportunity to thank you so much. And there's a lot of thank yous in the chat, and I know everyone really appreciated. I somehow in the silence I can feel people thinking, that you kind of got people moved and thinking, and it's really wonderful. Couldn't have had a better start to our series as well. And on that note, I want to just mention that, let's see, I don't know if I put it in the chat already. Oh, I did. There's just so many thank yous. We have one more webinar scheduled for August 19, and there will be others after that. So again, thank you, Jeremy, Alex, Christine, Avni, everyone who helped organize this. And thank you, Professor Emanuel, so much for joining us today.
Thank you all. Bye.
Right.